Everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome back to Knuckles and Gloves podcast. We're here to do some more history. We're not doing a true crime podcast today. Been doing a lot of those lately. We will return with them, but I am here with my buddy Aris Pina, CompuBox operator, and also a fellow fight history file like myself, donning the beautiful Willie the Worm Monroe t-shirt, signature t-shirt collector. Oh man,
absolutely. What's going on, my man? How are you?
Doing all right, man. I'm happy to be back. We had a
Owned by
little
Eddie
hiatus.
Futch, by the way, bro. I just have to throw that out there. Formerly owned by Eddie Futch. All right.
Willie for real?
Monroe. Yeah. That's absolutely.
I did not know. Damn. All right then. So it's not just a Willie the Worm shirt.
I know it's authenticated because the website I got it from is like the dude's one of the more premier collectors in the entire world of just everything. And if he says it's legit, then it's definitely. And who else would own a Willie Monroe shirt except Eddie Futch, probably? All right, so.
Well, I mean, I would believe you, and I would believe your collection, because your collection is pretty wild. So that's pretty awesome. But what better way to
I'm wearing the shirt for a reason today, and it's because of the subject we're about to get onto. So,
well, in what better way when we like to? I guess we've probably done the most consistent, or if not consistent, in terms of pumping them out, the most long-term boxing history kind of podcast thing. And I mean, we love this shit. And what better way to show that we love this shit than be rocking a shirt that literally like you'll never see anywhere else. That's pretty cool. But look, we're here today. The history we're talking, it's a subject that it gets talked about fairly often on social media. When boxing history comes up, there are a couple of pretty key players that get talked about when we talk about fighters and fights that have like little or no footage of them. And obviously there's going to be some sort of cutoff early 1900s where there's just no footage because it wasn't widespread. But even so, beyond that point, there are a lot of entries here, a lot of entries where did that video go? Was there video? Why haven't we seen this fighter, more of this fighter? So we're here to talk about that type of stuff today. It's always debated,
Absolutely, man. There's a lot of tape collectors out there who always claim to have rare stuff. Some of it you see, some of it you don't see. But there are holy grails that people are, for decades, way before we were born, probably potentially still looking for it after we pass away, of footage of fighters out there. Guys that, you hear the names all the time. One guy who's very popular on Twitter, Harry Greb, for instance. Because of the only footage that's out there is of him kind of fooling around shadow boxing and fooling around with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien and a playful sparring session, more or less, right? And so everyone bases it off of that and goes, well, what the hell? He's an all-time great. Look at how he fights. What is that? We don't have actual footage. We've still never seen actual footage of Harry Greb in a fight. And so he's always the one that usually gets brought up for the first one, right? But there's countless of other guys, all-time greats, who've had hundreds and hundreds of fights, and you're just kind of wondering, like, wait, what? Really? There's even a few modern fighters who I'm gonna, bring up. I'm sure you'll bring up as well, who you're gonna think about, and you think you've seen every fight of their career, and then you bring up a fight of theirs, and you're like, wait a minute, that wasn't filmed. I never seen that. Interesting.
Yeah, it's it's pretty wild. The guy that you brought up, I mean, you might as well just get him out of the way for real, because just to let listeners know, we're not going to be spending an hour and a half, 2 hours talking about Harry Greb. But he's easily the most famous or at least the most famous case of fighters where there's little or no footage. Now, it's been going around in the boxing history community for a handful of years now that some unknown person uncovered footage or a chunk of footage from some Harry Greb fight. Like, who knows exactly when?
I heard that years ago too, when there were writers out there who mentioned it and said that there was footage of the fight. It was like his second to last fight or something. But I think it's been rebuffed since. I have no idea. All I know is it's never been uncovered to the masses.
And if it really is, then it's never really been like proven, or it's never really been totally confirmed, or it's never really been released. I've heard that there have been some people who are willing to vouch for it and blah blah blah, but that pretty much means like almost nothing. You know what I mean? At this point, a guy who was and is now considered one of the greatest fighters of all time,
It's
just
not
based on
being.
his ledger alone, that's pretty wild. Like that, there's no footage. And so you bring up the footage of like him messing around, playing handball, training, hitting the speed bag. Just like a lot of footage from that time, the frame rate is messed up. And so it's like he looks all funny and he's moving all weird and shit like that. And even if you fix the frame rate, I think he doesn't really look super athletic. he, I mean, you see a lot of the kind of almost trick training type of stuff from Amir Khan. You see it from Ryan Garcia.
Mhm, mhm.
A lot of that kind of super fast, almost as if it's not. I don't want to downplay it because I'm slow as shit and I'm not in the gym doing nothing. But at the same time, it doesn't really seem to serve much of a purpose. But it looks very flashy. It makes them look really athletic and like they're acrobatic and type of stuff. And Harry Greb looks pretty much the opposite like that. Another dude we've brought up in this light is Bernard Hopkins, who looked kind of goofy when he's training, looks kind of goofy when he's running, not super athletic guy, but obviously a very good fighter. And then you see that footage of Harry Greb that does exist, and he looks goofy. He looks, how could this guy possibly? And anyway, we know that there was at some point, there were at some points fights that were taped, Harry Greb fights that were taped because they were in the papers and they were shown in the papers as being re-shown or shown in a theater or something like that.
Specifically in the Mickey Walker fights, the one that comes to
Exactly.
mind.
Exactly. And supposedly there were some cameras around. I don't know if they were the fancy motion picture cameras, but there were some cameras around when Jack Dempsey and Harry Greb sparred with their famous or infamous sparring session. But regardless, there's really a lack of stuff on him. So that leads a lot of people to kind of be skeptical as far as how he could possibly be considered among the greatest, not even the greatest, but even among the greatest. So it does kind of present a challenge as somebody who's like a history type of person to convince people who are non-believers. But I think that's kind of like a no-brainer at this point when you're able to see as many newspaper accounts, firsthand accounts, etc. It's not really much of an argument, but it does suck that there's no video footage.
I mean, to put it in perspective, I believe the footage that we've just been talking about just has been uncovered over the past like 30 something past years now.
They're always like message board rumors, people on forums and stuff like that, like 20 years ago, because that was the kind of the means of communication as far as like social media or whatever. When boxing was, as far as boxing is concerned, there were rumors, people would make posts, oh, I've heard about so and so uncovering footage of blah 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 fight, but there's never been any confirmation. So I don't know if it's even the same case. Maybe it is the same. I've heard more in recent years, like the past few years, slightly more credible people, I would say, making the claims, but it's kind of, regardless, it's still just claims.
I mean, we can only hope, man. There's so many fights of Greb's career that people would be salivating to see. Besides, the Tunney series, obviously. Who wouldn't want to see Tunney's first loss? Who wouldn't want to see the other fights? The other ones that arguably, according to the newspapers, that Greb should have won instead of Tunney. Greb's fights with Tiger Flowers, Greb's fights with, like I mentioned, Mickey Walker, Greb's fights with Kid Norfolk. Harry Greb's fights with, winning against Johnny Wilson. There's so countless. It goes on and on and on and on. And there's so many of them that Greb was such a popular fighter of that era. If to put it in perspective, he'd be one of the most absolutely popular fighters of today. I don't extremely. He would be in the same realm as probably the heavyweight champions. Everyone you want to put up there, he'd be one of those top guys. Him, Walker, all those type of people. They had that personality, they had that type of style, everything about them. People would love them. They'd be huge today. And the fact that there's no footage of him and he's considered an all-time great, like you mentioned, leaves this big like divide between historians who, if you it's common sense. You look at his resume, you look at his record, you see who he fought. There was nobody that he missed at that, basically, you know what I mean? Until his untimely death, you look up and down, he fought anybody and everybody. And he got the better of most of them. Like, you just on the base of that alone, he's an all-time great, you know, top 10 easily. And on the higher end of that, a lot of people have him at number one. And people can't understand that if you have no footage. I get that thing too, but you have to just look at it. It's resumes, you know, really trump all at this point. And Greb's really is at the top. And when you read all the accounts, and if you actually do your research on him and how he fought and everything, he really was a fucking windmill. Like, there was no way about it, man. If there was footage of him, you can see how he did not just this handball footage, like you mentioned, or palling around with an old Jack O'Brien. You know, you can probably see in perspective how much of a badass he really was, man. There was no fluff with Greb. He was a legit great. I just wish that I can only hope that one day we'll be able to uncover something. You know, we can only hope on that. Who knows?
Well, you talk about perspective and popularity and stuff like that. And I mean, back in the 1920s, when he was really, really popular, their means of social media or whatever would have been parties, going to bars, going to,
Yes.
you know, jazz clubs and stuff like that. So he was one of the dudes who was during a time where, you know, prohibition was kind of cloudy, I would say. And so there were ways to get alcohol and stuff like that, and it wasn't necessarily taboo, but it was a big political hot button issue. And he was right in the thick of a lot of that type of partying. He was a celebrity, not quite in the realm of a Jack Dempsey, but Mickey Walker, you know, same level, just you know, not quite
Absolutely.
Jack Dempsey,
Very,
but
very
nobody, you know, nobody was Jack Dempsey. There was like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, and that was
And
pretty
they were
much it.
just like one slight level below them. You know what I mean?
Right,
If they
that
weren't number
exactly.
one, they're
Everybody
either
else
one
was
that
below
game
them.
or like number two. Yeah, right there.
Right.
They're
Everybody
still
else was below them,
together.
just not that far below.
Exactly.
And that's exactly where Harry Greb would have been. And so today he would have been, I would imagine, on social media, messing around, you know, being a dumbass, being a whatever. So it's he probably would have been pretty popular. And at the very
you
least,
see, like, from his photos and even from those videos, you can get a sense of his attitude and the way he was just by his body language, from his smiles, his smirk, and the way he was playing around with people and all that. And it's still fascinating stuff to see. Considering if that's all
yeah.
we have right there, it's still extremely fascinating because you still have a look into the man who otherwise all you would have is just photos.
Well, and I think that another final point before we move on from Mr. Greb is that this is something that I see fairly often too, posting on the boxing history accounts and stuff like that, seeing reactions to some of the things that I post. Often in the early 1900s, late 1800s and early 1900s in particular, people make fun of the boxer poses. Like I think probably the classical, you know, this shit with the hands all messed up, or this shit. And then there's fighters who also make like weird poses, almost like they're wrestlers or something like that. And then a lot of the reactions to that and the Harry Greb footage are like, oh wow, they're fighting in that stance. How ineffective that must be. You couldn't possibly. And I think to myself, you don't think they messed around for photos and videos back then too?
I mean,
You don't think
clearly,
they, yeah, like you don't think that they were like exaggerating poses, like they didn't know what that was 100 years ago? Like, I don't,
90% of the footage that we see of those guys palling around, or what they call sparring back then, was them just fooling around.
Anyway, we can see a number of examples. Like Cliff Rold is a guy who's brought this up a whole bunch of times on Twitter, for instance, about there are fighters whose styles probably would not translate well in other eras. They would get handled. I think that Jack Johnson is a guy who probably would not do very well in another era against heavyweights who really know how to fight inside and aren't going to like capitulate to being held inside or, you know, pushed around inside. I think he'd be in big trouble against the Riddick Bowe, you know, or against the Lennox Lewis.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Big guys were like that, but he would, you know, he would be hot and cold. Certain guys he'd have success against, others most definitely wouldn't, like you just mentioned,
right.
for sure.
Right. And that's not to say he's not great. And there's no disrespect in like losing to a Lennox Lewis or Riddick Bowe on the inside. I'm not saying that. It's just that in terms of style translating to another era, you know, that's an example of, I think, a style probably not translating well to some other eras. However, there were other fighters. Tony Canzoneri is a guy from around that time, a little bit later, who was a fantastic fighter and whose style would have done just fucking fine in just about any era. Mickey Walker too. Mickey Walker was a very tricky, like pressuring counter puncher at times. He was a guy who was very skilled, you know, had a good punch all the way up through light heavyweight and into heavyweight, as who started as a welterweight. So, I mean, a lot of these fighters.
I'll give you, you know, I'll add something with Walker.
Yeah,
when
please.
I was a kid and I used to read, when I first got into boxing and I started reading the very, you know, World Boxing 95, Ring Magazine, KO, all them other shits. And some of them, a couple of them had like Pernell Whitaker against the all-time greats, this guy against the all-time greats, right? And every time the current fighter was matched against Mickey Walker never lost. And whoever, you know, in that mythical matchup. And that always caught my eye because Whitaker was always, you know, ahead of everybody else. I think in whatever magazine that was, they always had him, but they said Walker would have dominated him and knocked him out. In another article, I forgot who they matched him up against, but the same thing. Walker would have like laughed at him from his punches, broke him down, knocked him out, stopped him, and stuff like that. In almost every mythical matchup, Walker came out on top. And for whatever reason, that always caught my eye as a kid. And I was like, you know, who the hell is Mickey Walker and how is he beating up all these current guys if he's so old? But like, I just never forgot that. And that just kind of adds to your point how he probably would have, you know, succeeded in any type of era.
I think that aggression and punching power are the kinds of things in a fighting style that obviously are going to fit well in any era. I mean, generally speaking, because if you start getting into the crazy and weird tactical breakdowns, then yeah, boxers generally beat punchers and blah 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 style wise, but just in general, aggression, punching power, those are going to be things that are going to do fine in any era. I think that a lot of the discrepancies are going to be inside fighting, and a lot of the things that fighters were allowed to do inside in different eras. And now, when you compare it to now, the fact that fighters just generally don't even fight inside at all. So it's kind of depends on where you're placing these fighters and you're doing these mythical matchups and blah blah blah.
I'm gonna have a field day with a lot of these people today, man.
Yeah, totally. So anyway, Mickey Walker is definitely one of those guys, and Harry Greb, I think he probably could be, especially because he was a volume. He wasn't a big power puncher. He was a volume guy, and he was a guy who I think was going to be a pain in the ass for you on any given night, no matter what your style was, because he was just coming to Fritzy Zivic your ass, no matter what.
Just a couple of decades before him.
Yeah. Exactly. I guess Fritzy Zivic was actually Harry Greb in your ass, is what it was.
That's another guy too, you know, to kind of segue into that. I wish there was more footage of. Fritzy Zivic is generally considered, if not the most dirtiest fighter in history, one of the top 5, at least, you know, at the very least top 3. And there's footage of him. You can even find it on YouTube, but it's really grainy, really bad. I've never seen anything really clear, and I would love to see something if there was anything out there on him, like really up close, you know, they can really see him go to work.
And by the time that dude, like by the time anybody even like caught wind of his greatness, he was already like balding and like, you know, dude was a hard man. I want to say he was not a steel worker, but
he worked in the
some sort of mill. Yeah. Was it was a steel worker? Mm-hmm. It's something like that.
I think that was after his career ended too. That's what he ended up doing.
Damn. Anyway, he had like a particular, I have photos of it, and he had a particular title. But anyway, point being, we talked about this on a recent show where there's a different kind of strength that comes from when people are working like in construction and shit like that, working in a steel mill, working in a mine, you know, that kind of stuff. It's just a different ball game. And Fritzy Zivic was one of those fighters. Anybody who's going to be able to to get one over on Henry Armstrong, who's basically at his peak, is a hard fighter.
And to have so, when people look at his record, oh my God, he has 65 losses. And I get it. Like that might be the highest amount of losses. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it has to be up there for the highest amount of losses of a world champion ever. But if you look at his record, Fritzy Zivic, top to bottom, has one of the most impressive resumes in boxing history as well. There literally wasn't a dude Zivic ducked. Nobody. He fought everybody. There was not a person, whether you're white, black, whatever it was, he would fight you and he didn't give a damn, and he would go there and do his damnedest to take you out, and usually would somehow leave you with some kind of effect that you remember that you had to fight him. Whether he won or lost, you remember that you're in the ring with him and you were pissed off about it afterwards.
Totally. And there was not really a whole lot of regard for whether or not he had a full training camp, what weight the fight was at, yeah, where it took place, etc. But I mean, we've talked about this before, and I think there's kind of like a mistaken like romanticization of what that was. Like, he did it because that's just how he wanted to do it. And it's like, nah, bro, that's because that's how he had to do it. Because fighters were fighting that often, not just because they were hard badasses. They were, not saying they're not, but that's not the reason why they were fighting 200 times in their career. They're fighting 200 times because in a given fight, they were getting paid like $4,000. They weren't making $50,000, $70,000, $80,000 per fight. Those were just the really massive ones. And so, you have to fight 200 times over the span of 25 years if you're going to actually make money. And a lot of them, as we know, still wound up with not much money. I'm getting off the point. Point is,
but no, you're totally right. A lot of those all-time greats that we read about from the 40s and 30s and 50s, as they get older and they were still alive in the 70s and even the 80s, and they were, there's like reports of them going through the papers. And they look and they see how much a fighter's making at that point, and then they go squealing to their wife, "What the hell? Imagine me making that then what I could have made back then. This is bullshit." Blah, 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 and just going on and on and on. Like, I get it.
Yeah, it's a shitty situation, especially assessing like the greatness a lot of these fighters. But regardless, Fritzy Zivic is definitely one of those guys I wish we had more footage of. One fighter that I wish we had just anything on, really, or anything substantial, is Joe Walcott, the original Joe Walcott.
Potatoes, yeah.
For as long as he fought, number one, for as much as his weight fluctuated, or as much as he was willing to fight literally anybody. And I know a lot of it is just timing as far as who was getting recorded and whatnot and videotaped, but I really wish we had more examples of a fighter like him.
Dude, and he's one of those guys, exactly what you said, man. It's fascinating. He was short, kind of very stout, just built, but he was known as a giant slayer too. He knocked out Joe Kowinski. He knocked out countless guys bigger than him, but he also struggled with guys his own weight, which was kind of interesting. He lost to Kid Levine, struggled with Mysterious Billy Smith and others, but like, he's just an absolute animal in the ring. You know what I mean? One of those guys that, like, from that time period too, there's footage of Joe Gans. Hell, there's footage of Terry McGovern. There's footage of Battling Nelson. There's footage of Ad Walgast. No, I don't know of any footage of Kid Levine and a few others from that era. But as much as you mentioned as Walcott fought and how popular he was, there's absolutely nothing on it. The only footage that I know of, and I've seen it, it's on YouTube, and it's pretty fascinating in itself, is when, I think in the twilight of his life, when he was working at Madison Square Garden as a janitor, and he was interviewed briefly, and he's just given an account of his career and what he did a little bit, and wishes that he was still young enough to get back in there. And it's really awesome to watch, man. Every time I watch it, I'm fascinated by it, because Walcott was a fascinating fighter, a fascinating character, and yeah, there's really nothing on him.
That entire, like, again, I know some of it's timing as far as the technology and the popularity and whatnot, but there are a number of lightweights from right around that time, because that lightweight era was so incredible. You know, you mentioned Kid Levine, George Dixon. He was a little bit lower, but regardless, George Dixon's another fighter. But Abe Atel's another one where I'm like, you know,
I don't see anything on Abe Patel, and how is that possible?
well, as long as he was basically the ruler at featherweight and went up to lightweight, fought a whole bunch of times at lightweight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right around this era at lightweight had some truly incredible all-time fighters, and there's like almost no footage of a whole bunch of them, which is just wow.
And Abe Patel lived a long life. All right, like a very long life.
Involved in some other shit too, you know?
Yeah, exactly, with the White Sox and all that. But was the White Sox, Black Sox? Black Sox.
Well,
style, right?
that was just colloquially known as the Black Sox scandal, but yeah, it was the White Sox.
Yeah. Okay. So, but he lived a long life. I never even seen an interview from him like later on, because he was in Ring Magazine featured later and other stuff. Like there's nothing on him. But you would think that there was at some point he was on television for something, or looked upon, interviewed for whatever. There's absolutely nothing on Abe Patel. But again, and I kind of find that interesting, because again, he was extremely popular for the era. He fought everybody from that time period. And there's only little pockets of there's certain guys that, not to say there's tons of footage, but there's footage nonetheless of them. Joe Gans, battling Nelson, Ad Wolgast, certain Jim Jeffries, Stanley Ketchel, Billy Packey. A lot of these guys from that era, there's footage on them. Even other lightweights that I didn't mention, there's little pockets of things. But then you got all-time greats like Joe Walcott and Abe Patel and a couple of others who there's absolutely nothing. And it's kind of like, damn, like you read the accounts, and it was such a deep era too for that lightweight, welterweight era. And how many, the guys that were fighting, how often they were fighting each other and everything like that, that I would just, and how brutal, from the accounts that you read, how brutal those fights were, that I would die to see it. Even if it doesn't really play out as well when you watch it on I guess when you watch it on screen, how brutal those fights actually are. For example, when you watch the Stanley Ketchel, Billy Packey fights, people talk about how vicious they were and how crazy and bloody and yada, yada, yada. And then when you actually watch it, when you see it, and you kind of saying to yourself, well, they just look like they're mauling and clinching. But still, I just need to see it for myself. You know what I mean? Especially now with, how I've sent you some YouTube accounts. Like there's one guy out there, Smooth Legends, who is taking these old videos and enhancing them with these HD ways and slowing them down and doing this and that, and making them actually watchable now. And when you can see it, you can see now for the first time, at least in my eyes, what people were actually describing back then, and see the viciousness to how hard these dudes were getting hit and what was going down. And I'm just like, holy shit, this is awesome.
It is kind of like a double-edged sword or a paradox or whatever, because it's like, on one hand, I talked about Jack Johnson earlier. I don't want to portray it like he was unskilled, but it definitely was like, when you see footage of some of his fights, a lot of it is a lot of like mauling inside and stalling and stuff like that. Similar to Muhammad Ali, frankly, a lot of Muhammad Ali fights are just not good, dude, because there's so much holding, and it was like his gravitas or whatever.
Because of how shitty his opponent was too.
Well, and because of his like popularity or whatever, it was like he was allowed to get away with different shit. Jack Johnson, and it wasn't just Jack Johnson. A lot of that was the era and what referees allowed, period. But he was allowed to get away with a lot of stalling and holding and mugging and clinching and stuff like that. But even so, like you said, when you see some of this stuff enhanced, sometimes when you see up close, it's like, oh, there was subtle shit they were doing. They did know what they were doing. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was just that it wasn't that pretty to watch. It wasn't nearly as thrilling as I think that it was kind of made out to be, as like some sort of Gotti Ward or Corrales Castillo brawl or something like that, when it didn't look like that. And like a another good example would be, like I was thinking about one a minute ago. Dude, I almost hate to say it because it's like a sin. I'm somebody's going to attack me for saying this, but Dempsey Firpo, that shit is considered like an all-time, like, oh my god, slugfest, it's the greatest something something, like 2 round, and like, I'm okay, no, it's
I
good.
think
Like,
Ring Magazine rated that in the 90s when it did its 100 best title fights ever. I think it rated it like number 3. Title
and
fights,
and
not
I'm
even just heavyweight, just title fights in general.
and I'm just saying that I almost feel like people, like, that's, people just do it because like they feel like they have to, like that's just what's on the list. You like, almost like for however many years people are saying, oh well, Jack Dempsey's got to be like top 3 heavyweight, and it's like, no, he doesn't. He kind of didn't really accomplish a whole lot as a heavyweight. I mean, don't like, but that, well, he was so vicious, and it's like, no, like if we're talking about accomplishments, it was. But similarly, it's almost just kind of like the mythical majesty of this shit has been built up for so many decades that it's like people feel they just have to say it. But then, in my opinion, if you actually go watch Dempsey Firpo, it's a lot of pushing, a lot of like pulling and clenching and mauling, and there are punches for sure, but the massive, huge knockdown Firpo scored that knocked Dempsey through the ropes and had him killed, it pretty
Kind
much
of a
just
push.
looks like Firpo runs up and pushes him through the ropes.
Like he hits him, but it's like more of a push punch. It's not just
Yeah,
a
I
straight
mean,
up
it's not like a,
knock MC silly.
it's, yeah, it's not quite how it's portrayed, especially I think
Even when I was a kid, I noticed that. Like he was just, he and like yeah, he just kind of he
it's
goes
like the
with
ropes
Dempsey. If you
gave
notice it
way,
when
like
he pushes it with him too, and then. But I
yeah,
mean, it's still an incredible
sure, it
moment
hurt.
because everyone always said so. The first time in what was the word, an indignity ever like that ever happened to a heavyweight champion, as they famously said. But then, literally Dempsey comes in seconds later in the second round, just knocks him into another planet.
Yeah, like just knocked him down over and over, like in a bad
Over and
way.
over and over. Yeah.
Yeah, to the point where it's like it's difficult to count the knockdowns. So I mean, it's, I don't know, it's I don't want to shit on it because it's not a bad fight whatsoever. I'm just not entirely sure it deserves the acclaim that it often gets, like the automatic acclaim that it often gets. So to relate that to what we're talking about, sometimes it just doesn't translate that well on video, and sometimes you do see subtle things, but sometimes you see stuff and you're like, oh, it wasn't as good as they say. But even
Like I
so,
would imagine having a really enhanced version of battling Nelson at Wallagas. Like even in the version that we have now, you can hear the thuds on the punches and the way them dudes just beat the hell out of each other, how vicious it is. Just imagine if there was like up close and you had HD and actually witnessed that, because that's a fight that you can tell those two are whooping each other's ass.
oh
It
yeah.
wasn't,
Well, I
there
mean,
was no holding back on that one. There was no like, I mean, there was a lot of mauling, but there was just a lot
yeah,
of vicious, straight up.
one way or another, fighters aren't ending up with their faces and bodies looking like that from nothing. I mean,
Exactly.
granted,
Both of them look
the
like the straight up slab of beef that Rocky was beating up in the movies. All right.
I mean, granted, gloves back then was something else. And I mean, like, so taking some punches is almost like watching some bare knuckle shit today, where it's like 3 punches and homeboy's face is destroyed. But still, like you see, and that's like 45 rounds. So it's like, holy shit, bro. So
Yeah.
yeah. So to be able to see that, and to be able to see like that era of early 1900s and late 1800s lightweights, that was just incredible and possibly could never be matched in terms of depth, would be really cool.
For sure, man. But to bring it a little bit more modern, I guess, and like I mentioned before, the reason why I was wearing this shirt, the one fight that Marvin Hagler readily admits that he lost has never been filmed. And that was his loss to Willie Monroe. And historians still today are still talking about it, because not the fact that anyone's out there claiming that they have footage of it. It was never filmed unless someone snuck in something at the Spectrum that night that no one knows about and got like a reel of it, but it's never been filmed. There's reasons for it too, but that's the one fight of Marvin Hagler's career, and I kind of find that interesting. The one fight that he readily admits is lost, there's no footage of.
What were the reasons it was never filmed?
I think off the top of my head, there was a big snowstorm. I think it was there was a big storm, and it kind of like fucked everything up in terms of the crews and film crews and everything else trying to get there. But the show still went on, and people that made it there still were able to watch it. But yeah, the storm is what really messed it up. And
Oh,
from there was fight wasn't able to go on. I mean, not the fight. Excuse me. That there was no film of it from that, but the fight obviously still went on, and Monroe, by all accounts, put on the performance of his career. Like that was one of those that it didn't matter if he was going to be in a title fight or whatever it was going to be. Anyone would have had trouble with him that night. And Hagler was just a step ahead of him and took a beating.
well, Willie the Worm paid the price for daring to try to beat Marvin Hagler after that when they met again. So poor guy. Actually, there's actually a number of like Philadelphia area middleweights, probably a few light heavyweights too, from right around that area in the era of the 70s and early 80s that I wish there was more footage of. Or I mean, maybe there is footage, at least it's just not out there on YouTube and shit. Cyclone Heart, a lot of those like kind of guys who are from the Philly area who made for a really cool pack of fighters. Wish there's a little bit
Well,
more
yeah,
footage
man.
to
I
be able
mean,
to.
that was a deep, deep, deep era of middleweights back then, especially in the '70s. And Hagler went straight up into them. Like his first fight was against Boogaloo Watts, which he lost. But a
Well,
lot of people
and
said that he probably should have won that fight.
it would put Hagler's reign into perspective a little bit too, because I mean, people already love him and already believe he's an
Mhm.
all-time great middleweight. So it would just put a little bit more perspective into that, like seeing what he'd had to go through to get to the middleweight shot.
Absolutely. And yeah, because Hagler was one of those guys, he wasn't going to conform to anything. He was with Goody and Pat Petronelli, who, although they were good managers, trainers, and handlers for Hagler and were loyal to him, they didn't have a lot of power politically out there to really get him the opportunities that other fighters were afforded at that period. So they had to scrabble and struggle and get what they worth because one, he was really talented, he was tough, and no one was going to take a risk on a commodity that had no money like Hagler did at that point. So they had to make their bones. Like we mentioned before, when Don King had that sham of a tournament, the U.S. Championship tournament, um, the only way Hagler was going to be invited into it was this, as if he got rid of Goody and Pat and joined with Don King, and Hagler wouldn't have done that. And once he refused to do that, he was banned from that. So he's trying to find an avenue around here. He's trying to do something. He ends up in Philadelphia, and he's struggling out there. His first fight, he goes against Bobby Watts, and Boogaloo Watts was a really, really good fighter. One of those tough guys that wasn't championship material, but that's not to say that he wouldn't have been in another era. He was right on the cusp of that time. Being a top contender meant you probably would have been a champ in another era. And he even though he got the decision against Hagler showed his potential. It was a close fight, but Willie the Worm Monroe was the one who legitimately whooped on Hagler in that fight. Everything Hagler had, Monroe had an answer for that night. Hagler really had no answer for everything Monroe tried. Monroe had an answer for that night. And Monroe was just on the top of his game. It's just unfortunate that because of a giant storm and other stuff, circumstances that went on it was never filmed. They never had any television crews that were able to cover it or anything. And the few people that were there to witness it that night witnessed a masterclass from Monroe. But like you mentioned, Hagler learned from his mistakes, and I believe J. Russell Pelton mentioned that he had a chance to buy in with Hagler afterwards. I think the Petronellis asked him, if you'd be interested. And Peltz kind of said something to the effect of, he can't even be my middleweights from Philly. What can he do against the world? Why would I have any interest in him for? So, he obviously learned to like regret that immensely in the years later. But at that point, once Hagler lost to Monroe, I think he was matched up like you mentioned against Cyclone Heart soon after. And once Hagler was able to beat Cyclone Hart, that's when he started getting on a roll again. He fought Monroe in a rematch, ended up knocking him out, fought him again soon afterwards, blasted him in 2 rounds. He fought Bugaloo Watts right before he ended up winning the title and absolutely annihilated him. So, Hagler ended up okay, obviously, as we all know. But it's crazy to think that a fight like that, just because of circumstances, was never filmed, which segues that into another one, and that's a Mike Tyson fight that was never filmed. If you're familiar with that or not.
Wasn't there only, I want to say there was one or two. Might have only been this one. But I don't even know what it is off the top of my head. But I do remember when I was going back not too long ago, and I was basically just trying to find everything like Mike Tyson, because I created a video that was every Mike Tyson knockout that was filmed in order, and I put that together. So I found everything I could, and I remember like looking around, and when I had done a search for it, they were like, "Oh yeah, it doesn't exist." There were other posts that
It
had
was one
suggested
fight
it
against
didn't
a guy
exist.
named by the name of Larry Sims early in his career.
Then I'm sure that was the one that was it then.
And there's various reasons for that too. They were saying that the film crew showed up late. One theory is that the film crew showed up late, and the Tyson fight was already over by the time they showed up. And the other one was that Tyson didn't look good because he was extended a little bit, and Sims was playing survival tactics, so Tyson didn't look as devastating as normal, so it was destroyed. Who knows? But interestingly
Interesting.
enough, people don't mention it. I mean, not really, because you go through Tyson's career and everyone says, oh, the full Mike Tyson career, X, Y, and Z. But I did remember as a kid reading that. And then I had to look it up today to remember which opponent that actually was. But I did remember reading in an old Ring magazine article that there was a Tyson fight that was never filmed.
Huh.
And that was the
I
one.
wouldn't even have thought of that. So
Yeah.
that's a good call.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think that, like, you think you've seen every Mike Tyson fight because they've all been filmed. Hector Mercedes fight, the John Anderson fight, John Michael Johnson, like Lipscomb, all those, early guys they knocked the hell out of that are just, footnotes in history. You've seen clips of them, whether they're grainy or whether they appeared on ESPN or whatever. But there's that one
Yeah.
fight that you kind of forget about.
Well, and even I think that it's like you could see that way back when Customato and the people around him, the people who were helping finance Mike Tyson's career, Jim Jacobs and all these foos, they understood what they had on their hands, and so they were even filming sparring sessions. They were filming a lot of his amateur fights. I'm sure, maybe some of them they weren't allowed or something like that, but just about anything they could, it seemed like. And there was that
Yeah,
early,
there's a lot of early Tyson footage out there, like you mentioned. A lot of his amateur fights. There's a cool clip of him sparring at like 16 years old against a seasoned heavyweight, um, who was an undefeated pro at the time, and Tyson was giving him the business. You know what I mean? So like, it's out there.
putting the beats on his ass. Yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah. Like Mike was
straight up. Well,
problem. Jimmy Clark was his name. Excuse me. Yeah, Jimmy Clark.
what I believe it was 19, it was either 84 or 86. I'd have to look it up, but either 84 or 86, they made that amateur documentary about him called just Tyson. And like, it's on YouTube, it might not even be under that name. It's probably, I want to say it's on that International Boxing Hall of Fame 2 account, I think,
Mhm.
that has a whole bunch of documentaries and shit. And but even back in the day, when you got a videotape, like a VHS of this documentary, same thing. It was just that like early to mid 80s, like super basic video editing, like almost like pinkish, weird stripe across the bottom of the screen that just says Tyson, because that's like the only thing that they could do as far as video editing for a title. And it's like, I mean, it's not that long, it's probably like an hour. A lot of it is like behind the scenes shit with Mike, And I think that that's actually where they pulled a lot of when they've done documentaries about Tyson, or they've done like movies about him and shit, like the HBO movie that they did about him, and a lot of those
I
scenes with
remember
him
that
up in
movie.
upstate New York, where they pulled that from this documentary, because it shows him at dinner with Cuss and Cuss's partner and all sorts of shit. So anyway, yeah, dude, there was even a documentary about the dude before he even really got big. So there's no question there's all sorts of footage, and it's crazy that despite all that footage, there's just this one fight that doesn't exist.
And it's not even like a big major fight. It's just the fact that it doesn't exist is what kind of
Right.
gets you, you know. It wasn't
Exactly.
like anything substantial really happened. Tyson just knocked out a guy that was never heard from again.
That's like the most notable thing about the fight, is that it wasn't filmed.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
That's
just
like
the
the
fact that the
funniest thing.
footage doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Imagine if footage turned up and someone was like, you know, put a wild price tag on it. Someone would definitely buy it. And it would be like with the premise saying that you can't show it to the public, whatever. Someone would do that because that's what people do.
Well, and I mean, I guess that kind of gives me an opportunity to, I will nicely rant. I won't be mean about it, but I am going to state my annoyance at the fight collecting community, because look, dude, I've been, ever since I learned in the early 2000s how to trade fights through MIRC, the old chat program, it was like a new world opened up, and I was like, holy shit, I don't have to like buy videotapes through Ring Magazine or anything. Like I can watch fights here on my computer, like right here, or put them on some device or some shit, you know? And so when, as soon as I like, you know, understood that these kinds of things could be collected and blah, blah, blah. And then very soon after that, torrents were invented, or at least spread to the public. And it was like you can download fights through torrents and blah, blah, blah. And so I kind of got to know some of the fight collecting community a little bit, but there's still a lot of really old school fight collectors who collect video, who collect films, who collect 8 millimeter, well, all sorts of millimeter, all sorts of kinds of film. And it's just annoying to me that I know for a fact some of them have things and fights and training footage. Some of them even have family footage, like personal home video footage that nobody else has. Like literally nobody else has, and possibly has not seen for decades, if at all, really. And just like keep it. And if I'm not trying to tell somebody what to do with their own property. I'm just saying that if that were me, I just feel as though it would be more enjoyable to like share it. So I don't know. I don't know precisely what fights I'm talking about or anything like that. I just know for a fact that there are collectors who kind of withhold stuff, and I'm just like, that sucks. Because there are a lot of fights I wish I could enjoy, and I had a lot of fights that I wish other people could enjoy too. So it's just to piggyback off what you're saying, my mild annoyance. That's all.
Absolutely, man. Just preaching to the choir over here, bro.
No, it's
But
it's just, I guess to me it's like, dude, they're made to be enjoyed, or like whatever. If it's on video, that's the whole point of it. Is, at least I feel that way. So
one another guy though to mention, that to stay in the whole Philly thing, if we'll to go back to the Philly thing actually, would be Gypsy Joe Harris. You know, one of those fascinating fighters that legendary in Philly circles, you know, and especially for people that era who had a chance to witness him, if you had a chance to see him fight, you know, he still talked about in hushed tones almost. And, you know, the only footage that's known of him is his last fight against Emil Griffith, just like a small clip of it, I think. You know, nothing else is really uncovered about him, but from all accounts, man, because of, you know, the way he was blind in one eye. And so to compensate that, his style was like Emmanuel Augustus, I guess, but like add some more layers to it and even more, but not saying craziness, but just like if you read his style, like he was just on another level than anyone had ever seen before. And he was doing stuff that no one had ever seen and would leave guys flabbergasted and flustered, and was really successful at it, and was poetry in motion and legit. Like best way to describe it, if you watch someone like if you listen to free jazz like Ornette Coleman for example, or something similar to that, Coltrane getting a little bit wild, and you put, but there was still like some kind of structure to their music. It wasn't just completely off the walls out there. Then you get a sense of how Gypsy Joe Harris would fight, at least what I've read. That's how I try to interpret it, you know?
I think
Does that
you
make
have a
sense to you?
much it does. You have a much better grasp of jazz and like the theory behind it than I do, because you play drums and have, you know, actually done it. I mean, I played guitar for a long, long time, so I probably understand it a little bit better than the average person. But it's like I do have a difficult time when I'm listening to that kind of like free range jazz where it's improvisational and it sounds a lot of times so dissonant. It just doesn't sound like it goes. It just sounds like people playing some random shit. But then
Yeah, man.
it's
There's way
but
different levels of it.
but there are sometimes songs or movements, jazz movements, where it sounds that way, but it's almost like they're like cogs that are moving at a different speed. And then every so often they meet up and it's like, oh shit, that's what they're doing. It's almost like look, here's a really dumb example, right? Like somebody's probably going to hear this and go, what the fuck are you talking about? Have you ever sat at like a stoplight and you have your turn signal on, and so you can hear the click, 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 click. And it's like you're looking at the car in front of you and they also have their turn signal on and they're moving at different speeds. But then every so often they meet up and go blink together. And you're like, wow, that's kind of like how that jazz shit is, dude. Every so often it's like they meet up and you're like, oh, that's nice. But sometimes getting to that point, and with fighters, there are some fighters. I mean, Augustus is maybe a pretty decent example, but a lot of fighters who, I don't know, maybe even Purnell, where you're watching them and it doesn't seem like it makes sense. It doesn't seem like what they're doing would work. Like, why does that work? How are you making that work? But it does. And not only are they
Benitez,
making it work, they're
Noche,
fucking good at it, you know?
guys that can just make you miss by microseconds and then make you pay for it. But Harris was different. Like when you watch Emmanuel Augustus, and everybody, have seen him, all of his antics on ESPN and all that, the Drunken Master, and you see the way he would start going the bop and the things like that, kind of going to the whole style that he said he got from playing Tekken, which is pretty cool in itself. But I mean, it is. Tekken's a badass game. But with Gypsy Joe Harris, not only was he ended up he did that, but he like again, there's only small footage of him. There's not a lot on that. The fact that he lost his eye early on in a fight, in a street fight as a kid, like I think some kid took a brick to his eye and smashed it, whatever the curse may be. He lost his eye when he was young. He ends up getting into boxing, and to compensate, having only vision in one eye and no one knowing about it, he does his style in a way that to make sure that he can still see out that one way, but like he does it in a way that it's like, something unlike anyone's ever seen. He's stipping, diving, he takes elements of all this slickness and all these other styles and just kind of makes it into his own. Like he'll take a little bit of Jersey Joe Walcott, he took a little bit of this one, a little bit of that, all these different things. And at that point in time, when you were talking about the 60s, when he was, active as one of the top welterweight contenders in the world, and junior middleweight around that era, a lot of these dudes have still never seen anything like that. A lot of them still, aside from Sugar Ray Robinson, a few others, everyone else is still kind of straightforward, having a normal style, kind of move forward, nothing really too fancy, right, Pat? So to see a guy like Harris come on the scene, everyone's flabbergasted. What the hell are you seeing here? And then no one ever seen anything like that. No one knew that it was because of his eye that he had to fight like that. This is what he had to compensate to do something for. The fact that he had to change his style up and make it different actually worked to his advantage, because he fucked everybody up in that way. They go into him, you're watching him, and you're like, how do I even fight someone like this? They had
Yeah,
no idea how to handle him, and he
it's a
became a
fucked up
phenomenon
rhythm.
because of it. Yeah, it's wild. If you watch this footage with Griffith, you can see exactly how it ends. Very brief, and the footage isn't that great, but you can see what people had talked about is definitely out there. Tevin Farmer actually I guess I can use him as an example. Fights kind of similar in a style in terms of like the dips and the movements that he would use in China, stuff like that. But it's still Gypsy Joe had something on another level and completely unlike himself. But like people who are from Philly, who are in the scene, who are fans, writers, whatever it may be, in the boxing circles, still talk about him like that today. How much of a phenomenon he was, and it's unfortunate that his career was cut so short because of him only having one eye, that they found out about it, and the circumstances of what happened to him afterwards, because his career, his life completely fell apart after that. Like, he begged them, saying, if you do not let me fight, like, I'm going to fall into the streets. I have nothing else to fall back on. I can fight. Please just let me do this. And they refused. And after they refused to let him, he did fall back into the streets, unfortunately. But what's even crazier is that during an era in the 60s, when a lot of these fights were filmed, boxing was very popular in Philly. All of his contemporaries have plenty of footage on him. Kitten Hayward, Curtis Cokes, Emil Griffith that we mentioned, a lot of other Philly fighters. There's nothing on him. Nothing except for that last clip. But I've talked to people and they say there's footage of him out there. I've talked to Peltz, actually. He says he has footage of him. It's never been seen.
Well, I will kindly guide everybody back to my comments about that one that I made a couple minutes ago. But ultimately, like I said, it doesn't belong to me, and I can't demand anything from anybody. And I will say, I will force this segue. Damn it! One thing that I'm happy we don't have footage for relates to our sponsor. Because support for Knuckles and Gloves is brought to you by Manscaped, the men's below the waist grooming champions, lineal champions too. Oh no, I can't say ring champion, but lineal champions of the world. Manscaped offers precision engineered tools for your most sensitive parts. And speaking of which, Manscaped just launched a 4th generation trimmer called the Lawnmower 4.0. So you should join over 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with this exclusive offer of 20% off plus free worldwide shipping with our exclusive code GLOVE, GLOVE, and go to manscaped.com to use that code. So get 20% off free shipping using our code GLOVE at manscaped.com. Unlock your confidence and always use the right tools for the job with Manscaped.
Certainly.
That's what I got. So there's actually, you brought up with the funny styles and stuff like that. One thing, it's like, we do have some footage of this fellow. There's not a whole lot though. But one thing I did that kind of reminded me with the funny styles, I actually made a couple, like a Twitter thread. I don't know, it might've been about a year ago, about an indigenous Australian fighter named Jerry Jerome, who fought only from about I think it was like 1908 to, I had it pulled up here in a sec. I'll just look instead of estimating, from 1908 to 1915. So he didn't fight all that long. And I think he was like 38 or some shit like that when he made his professional debut. But he was an indigenous Australian who grew up in an area that was known for basically its squalor, for its really poor conditions. And long story short, he became somewhat famous in Australia as a fighter because he was a really defiant dude. They had, I don't want to go too far into it because you'll get me talking for fucking ever about this shit because it's really interesting to me. But long story short is that when basically a bunch of fucking white people were trying to control indigenous people in Australia, as they were wont to do, and had made a bunch of laws and shit like that, like indigenous people couldn't drive, or they had to ask permission to marry so-and-so, or to marry outside of their tribe, and things like that. All sorts of fucked up shit. As we know, things happened in that way. But Jerry Jerome was extremely defiant and considered a troublemaker. But bringing it back to why I bring him up, there is footage of him on YouTube. You kind of have to sift through some of the videos to actually find the footage. but man, he has a really funky style. Like he's twisting and twirling all over the place, turning his back, like dipping, diving. It's pretty hilarious to watch, but you could also see how that could be incredibly effective to like it would be such a pain in the ass to fight somebody doing that shit. So I mean, like I could totally see that people being baffled by those styles.
I'll bring up another guy that I read about as a kid, and it makes me think of that now. Not on, again, that's just his antics would make everybody just be like, what the fuck if he was around today? You ever hear a guy, Ray the Windmill White? He was a light heavyweight that was active from the late 50s up until the mid 70s. Never became a champion, but he was like a fringe contender and stuff like that. The reason why he was called the Windmill is because he was out of his, like, referees, everybody hated him, all right? Like, they couldn't stand him when he used to fight because he would pull the most ridiculous antics because he had fun with doing it, but it was, like, effective for him. Like, he would, it was after a fight that he had where he got beat up by, who was the heavyweight, the heavyweight that went the distance with Frazier back in the day. Actually, I gotta look it up now because that was bothering me.
I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, Scrap Iron Johnson.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so he lost to Scrap Iron Johnson.
George
After
Johnson,
that, he
yeah.
came, when he was doing that, he was still, Ray White was still a normal boxer. You can find some, I think there's a couple of his fights on YouTube, and I think Ellie Sackback or someone found him too, to interview him recently. But his fights, I first read about him in Ring Magazine, the same thing. He was just like, he would do these double dip punch where he would do like a double fist and jump ahead of you, punch from the back, slimmy shy, do all these other things, do around, just made everything a big joke. And he was annoying for opponents, annoying for referees. Everybody couldn't stand him because of all the stupid shit he would pull, but it was effective for him. And he would, he did enough boxing that he brought himself to win like the NABF light heavyweight title, and I think was considered for a title fight at one point. He was popular. He was popular in the California area. But mentioning those crazy guys and their funny antics and stuff like that, I just felt like bringing them up.
Yeah, there was another dude who was another guy who used to fight a shitload of exhibitions in San Francisco back in the day too. Had a really funky style that Jack Dempsey said was like he fought exhibitions with him a couple times, and he was like, fuck this, and it helped convince him that he shouldn't like ever be in the ring ever again. I can't remember who it is. I want to say it was like Porky Dan Flynn or some shit like that, but that wasn't him. It was.
Here's a quick question. There's never been footage uncovered of Jim Jeffries against either Bob Fitzsimmons or Jim Corbett, right? As far as I know. And there's Jim Jeffries footage. I know there's not a lot out there from his title fight. I know Gus Poulin and some of Tom Sharkey is out there, but as far as I know, the two fights where he really took an ass whooping before he came back to win.
Not to my knowledge.
Unless it was just like reenactments. Interesting.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. And I'm not going to lie, dude. I'd kind of like to see like several rounds of Bob Fitzsimmons taxing that ass, and then all of a sudden
that's what I was
sparked.
saying. I've read so much about it, like, because if you read the accounts, you read that like Jeffries took an unholy beating in those fights,
like to the point where like it should have been stopped several rounds.
Anyone would have stopped those fights. There's no way in hell those fights would have continued today. If you read how he looked, he was cut above cut above and below, almost to the bone of his eyes. His nose was smashed. His face was just beaten to a pulp. His body was beat up. Fitzsimmons was just beating him like a fucking water bag. And it was almost like a point of exhaustion, and Jeffries hitting himself that just like wore Fitzsimmons out and knocked him, before Jeffries put the coup de grace on him. Coup de grace, whatever you want to call it, coup de grace. Excuse me. Sound like Leon.
I got a Merlot Broham.
Yeah.
Brahm.
But like, you know what I'm saying? Like, think about that shit. Like, I would love to see that. Not to say even if it was like grainy footage, but like enough to because the only footage I've really seen of Fitzsimmons is him knocking out Corbett. But you read about that, and then the Corbett thing too. Corbett didn't beat up Jeffries, I don't think to the extent that Fitzsimmons did, but by all accounts, still he was whooping him and slapping him around like it was nobody's business for a number of rounds before Jeffries caught up to him. Same thing. There's nothing out there.
Yeah, dude. Well, in for that matter, the fight that went the distance between he and Sharky in like
Yeah.
1898 or 1899, you know, by pretty much all accounts was like bloody as shit, you know, brutal as hell. That was the one that made Sharky's
Didn't they say too
infamous.
like the lights fell from the ceiling, like from the ceiling and was burning them too, or something from that matter?
I I'm not sure if that
One
was
of
the
those
one where
made
that
that count. I
happened.
almost think it was Jeffries that said that.
I'm not sure if that was the fight where that happened, but one right around that time was when they were trying to, they were like experimenting with lighting because of the moving picture boxes. And
Yeah,
they
yeah, yeah.
needed better lighting for that shit, like way better lighting because it needed to be like white hot lighting. And supposedly they had lowered the lights to the point where it was like burning the fighters and it, like, you know, they could see like smoke coming up from them and like singeing their hair. I don't know if that's true. It might have just been the steam too, because you know all the sweat needs to evaporate. But yeah, uh, Sailor Tom Sharkey infamously, like you could see in photos too, had an awful cauliflower ear that looked like it needed to be drained like every other day. And supposedly that was that was the fight that made it like exponentially worse. And by the end of the fight, his ears like flopping all over the fucking place, like awful. People are like, you know, taking the kids away, you know, leading them away, women puking
You can
ringside.
see
No, not really,
there's
but
grainy photos of them clinching, and you can see Sharky's face just like you can see the marks on it. You know what I mean? Imagine
yeah,
if them
dude,
shirts were clear and in color, and you really get an up close view of it. Like you can even see from that the damage done to both guys, for that matter. Because Jeffries took his share of licks in that fight too. Again, there's nothing out there. You know. Well, I mean, I don't know. There's footage of him and Sharky. I don't know which fight it is, but I've seen footage on YouTube at least. And like I mentioned, the guy I aforementioned earlier, Smooth Legends, posted up Jeffrey clips of Jeffries against Gus Rulin recently. But the fight, you know, that I've always been fascinating by, him against Bob Fitzsimmons, there's nothing out there.
you know, there's
And I just
another.
want to see Fitzsimmons footage in general. Like I don't care if he's fighting or anything. I'd love to see him
Yeah,
just wandering around with his pet lion or being interviewed or doing something. Like I don't see
he's
anything. You see
so
footage of Sullivan as an old
such a
man. You see
character.
footage of Corbett. You see footage of all of his contemporaries. You don't really see anything of Fitzsimmons.
Such like a funky character, lanky, weird looking, you know, like just like he's got the haircut like a San Diego Padre friar, you know,
Yeah.
because he's like just bald on top and it's like going nowhere. And he's looking like somebody's grandpa, but he's a blacksmith. So I was talking about this earlier, that kind of strength that comes from doing like manual labor. And he could punch like a motherfucker, apparently.
And
So
he was really
yeah,
smart. Like he knew how to hurt you. He just knew it, like the whole body placement and where to actually, land punches, the maximum and all that shit.
for sure. That would be pretty cool to have some Fitzy, some Ruby Rob footage. Dude, there's another fight too, and I wrote about this like a couple of years ago. Didn't write, it wasn't like a lot, but I wrote like a blurb about it a couple of years ago. Another fight that I wish we had footage of, and I mean this kind of opens up a whole new conversation in the why the fuck don't we have footage of this fighter you know, question. But in 1909 in Paris, Joe Jeanette wound up defeating Sam McVeigh. And for that matter, why the fuck don't we have footage of, you know, like, I mean, fighters of that caliber? Do we have more Harry Wills footage? We don't have like shit on Jeanette or Sam McVeigh that's really usable. And in 1909, they fought like they were among this group of heavyweights that fought each other like umpteen times. And in this particular fight in 1909 in Paris, uh, supposedly, and obviously there's absolutely no way to verify this whatsoever, but supposedly there were upwards of 40 knockdowns between them in this fight. 4-0, not 14. Even 14 would be nuts, but 4-0. And after, you know, getting the absolute shit kicked out of him for several rounds in a row, Sam McVay wound up retiring in his corner after 49 rounds. And there are photos of this fight, and they're actually pretty good, all things considered, you know, considering they're from 1909 and from basically like a Paris circus venue. And even so, you can see in the corners, in each fighter's corner, shit is like so bloody, it's absolutely terrible. Like, it's like horrifying. It's good that we're only a few days away from Halloween and talking about it, because it's fucking gruesome as shit, almost, like, especially for 1909. But you can see that it's a rough fight. And any fight going 40 plus rounds, dude, is going to be rough. And I think that that's, you know, to not get away from it too far here. We've talked about fights in these earlier eras a number of different times, and we've talked about like the watchability and the entertainment value, or the possible entertainment value of some of these fights. Dude, I think that with some of these fights too, you'd be getting into like the 30 and 40 round range and shit, where like they'd just be unwatchable. They could not, there's no possible way that a human being could still be fighting
Yeah,
after that
man.
many
You're not
rounds.
gonna even Salvador Sanchez, man, who might have had the best gas tank of anyone in history, is gonna be gassing out by round 20 something. Like those fight to the finishes
And
at
like,
that point. You know,
understandably.
absolutely. But again, I know exactly what you're talking about. They have some great photos of it. I first learned about that fight in the book that we brought up countless times on the show, the history of boxing, the
Yep.
historical, you know, when that
Like the illustrated history of
yeah,
boxing or
illustrated
whatever.
history of
Yeah.
boxing with Nat Fleischer, and yeah. So that was the first time I read about it. You know, I think the photo had Jeanette standing over Sam McVay. But it's, again, that's one of those fights that, like, there's footage of them, of each fighter out there, but there's not tons of it out there. You know, compared to Jack Johnson, like you mentioned, Harry Wills, even Sam Langford for that matter. There's, you know, a few things of Langford out there compared, you know, two of the guys who are respected and mentioned amongst them as two of the greats who never won a title, and, you know, part of that whole era and everything like that. There's little to nothing, and that's really unfortunate. To the point
Yeah.
where McVay, a lot of, you know, back in the early '90s, you know, back in the day, was actually compared and saying that he was he was the Mike Tyson of his era. And a lot of people would mention that because there was no footage of him, and that's how a lot of people based him and how they read about him, how they kind of came up with his style. They're like, oh yeah, he was Mike Tyson, he was this and that. That's how they thought of him. And then when his footage actually came up, and when you saw it and you realized, and you're like, wait a minute, he fought nothing like Mike Tyson. Like, that was, you know, completely off the way we were describing that. So, you know, it's interesting how perspectives change when you finally get footage of these guys for the first time. But there's still not enough of it. You get glimpses of it, and even then, the glimpses that we have, the footage sometimes isn't so great that, like, you still can't make like a great comparison. You still really can't make a great judgment on it, because it's like, fuck, man, we have something, but I can barely see anything out of this.
Yeah.
What's
And
even
I
more
mean,
wild, though, at least we have footage of McVay and Jeanette. You know what's even more mind blowing to me is that a guy like Jack Britton, for instance, who is recognized as one of the all-time greats. A lot of people, you know, modern people today don't remember him because he fought almost 100 years ago, and did fight over 100 years ago.
how do Ted Kid Lewis and Jack Britton fight like 19 times and not one of them
And there's
win?
nothing on them.
What?
Literally nothing. Or there's no footage of Benny Leonard fighting Jack Britton, which obviously was a huge fight back then. That would have been a super fight today. Benny Leonard, the lightweight champion, moving up to fight Jack Britton, the welterweight champion. You know, like, if that was happening in today, everyone on Twitter would be talking all kinds of shit about that, how big of an event it would be probably be on pay-per-view, you know? And there's nothing on that. And Britain is one of the all-time greats. The guy had, and, you know, not even counting, like, over 100 fights, way over 100 fights. And that's not even counting all the newspaper decisions and all the other shits that he went through too, that he fought, right? Like, that's over 300 fights he had altogether. And there's no footage of him. as far as anyone's ever seen. Like, I've looked it up. I've searched for him before. I've gone to message boards, or, for the historical people who would know this shit. Everyone has the same thing. They think they've seen something, they haven't. There's nothing out there on it, and that's mind blowing.
Yeah, dude, that's pretty nutty, man. And just the caliber of these fighters too. And I mean, I guess it's useful to talk about some of the technology, and this is the kind of shit that somebody might have learned from like watching Inglorious Bastards, where there's that little clip where they talk about the combustibility of film and stuff, and film that was used. I mean, we're talking about several different eras here, so there were different kinds of films used, and I'm not trying to propose that I'm a fucking film buff here, that I'm an expert, but I do know that back in the day when a kinetoscope or an early video camera would have been used to tape something, the film that was used was either flammable, highly degradable in terms of, like, if you didn't transfer it to something else, and then in certain eras there would have been no option to transfer that film to anything. It's just film, so that's the only thing you got. So there is a pretty distinct possibility with a lot of these fighters that some of the shit was filmed, and we've just lost it over the years because it could not be preserved. It got lost. Those were the only copies we had, and they're gone, or they were in a house fire, or such and such archived burned down, or got fucked up, or bombed by a war, or some shit. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's just a staggering amount of fighters, and a staggering amount of great fighters for that matter. If you were for instance to go through, I don't know, just pick Nat Fleischer, because it's easy, and a lot of people are going to be familiar with who he is, and you respect his opinion and stuff like that. But you go through and you look through like who he rated as the best fighters he'd ever seen, or his top fighters, and almost all of the top fighters are like, there's like almost no film of them, or very, very little film of them. Benny Leonard, he's always spoke super highly of Benny Leonard, always spoke super highly of Stanley Ketchel. Like, there's some footage of Stanley Ketchel, but you'd almost think there'd be a little bit more of him too. Though the Johnson fight's pretty good, not gonna lie, but still, a lot of these fighters that are considered like some of the greatest of all time, especially back then, it's just staggeringly little footage of. So you would have had to have seen them with your own eyes.
I wish there was footage of Benny Leonard against Jack Britton, because that's always been gone down as one of the more controversial fights, title fights in history. And it's almost been 100 years ago. It's going to be 100 years next year when it, actually, or for when it took place. And it's crazy to think, by all accounts, Britton, was whooping on Leonard in the fight, right? Well, not whooping on him. It was a close fight, but Britton, the old champion, was getting the better of it. He crowded Leonard. He was outboxing him a little bit, and he was getting. But Leonard, obviously being the great that he was still landing back on him. But when he finally cornered Britton and got him and dropped him with a body shot, he inevitably ran right to the center of the ring and decked Britton while he was still on one knee. At that point, you couldn't do that, and he was promptly disqualified by former pro Patsy Haley, and all hell broke loose. Everybody had their own opinions. Either Leonard threw the fight, there was a dive, there was this, there was that, something happened. Why the fuck would that happen? But that was really, really controversial. And again, we're talking almost 100 years ago, just about. If that happened today, everybody on Twitter would be exploded, going nuts that the lightweight champion of the world in a huge mega fight walked up and clobbered, Roy Jones, Montel Griffin style, the welterweight champion, and took him clean out and got disqualified for it. People would be going uproaring right now talking about that. So imagine how that was back then.
And one of the craziest things about it is like nothing even happened. Nothing even came of it. He fought like a week and a half later.
Everyone, Leonard just kind of told him, like, look, man, I lost my head, and that was it. Take it as face value. And Leonard was so respected back then that even though people making gripes and saying stuff, they just kind of went with it.
Exactly. Nobody was like, well, okay, we believe him. He's a stand-up fellow.
Yeah, he just he got pissed off. All right, whatever.
And then like a week and a half later, he beats the crap out of Rocky Kansas, who himself is an extremely respectable fighter, and then makes a defense a couple weeks after that against Lou Tendler. I mean,
So I almost, you know what? And when you think about it, like Leonard was the type of dude that he was beating everybody so effortlessly back then that the fact that he was getting whooped on. Well, I keep on using that word. Excuse me. But the fact that he kept that Britain was getting the better of him in the fight and like outboxing him, whatever it was, Leonard might have been flustered by that. Like, what the fuck? I'm not used to this. You know, maybe he did lose his head. Who knows? Like, and when he finally dropped him, he just kind of ran up and was like, you know, let me just finish this off without thinking twice about it, kind of Dempsey style. But like, I don't know. Who knows? It was the first time I read about it again from Ring Magazine. Like there's been theories on it that Leonard threw the fight, that it was supposed to be like that, but by all accounts, like you said, man, everyone just kind of forgot about it and moved on. They're like, well, whatever, you know. Britain wasn't champion much longer after that, anyways.
No, it didn't last too much longer. But
The fact of the matter is, though, bro, Britain turned pro around 1904, and he ended his career in the early 30s. There's no footage of him. How is that possible? That's almost 30 years of being a pro.
yeah, dude, that's nuts. And it wasn't like he was just some unknown dude either. He
No,
was a
man, he
pretty
was one of the
very
top
well-known
fighters of
guy.
the 1920s. Absolutely. He was maybe not the same popularity as Walker and Greb, but in terms of respectability and being like legitimate, you know, just a fighter, yes, he was on the same level as all those guys easily. He got the better of Ted Kid Lewis in their series. You know, he was a great, great all-time great fighter. And he had an incredible chin too.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the ways in which he was remembered back then as having an all-time great chin. Crazy shit, man. You know,
Yeah.
another group, this entire group, like just to save time, uh there's a whole, you know, this group actually has its own name. Well, unfortunately, like it's extremely interesting, but it's unfortunate how they came about. The Black Murderers Row, a number of the fighters who are considered among the Black Murderers Row or fought members of the Black Murderers Row and themselves were great fighters. There's either very little or no footage. Coco Kid, Eddie Booker, Holman Williams, Lloyd Marshall,
Jack Chase.
Jack Chase. You know, there's a number of these fighters that have like just either no footage or they've come up in recent years with like the grainiest of grainy footage where it's like,
There is like a
cool, there's 30
15-second clip
seconds
of
of
Holman
something.
Williams, and that's it.
Yeah, dude, it's like, and don't get me wrong, I guess that's definitely better than nothing, but it's almost like a letdown, like a tease.
The Lloyd Marshall footage that's been uncovered over the years has been pretty awesome. I will say that. Especially the, you know, the one where he's fighting in Europe and you see like his signature bouncing off the ropes.
Yep. Yeah,
Where
dude,
like,
I think
which is
somebody
pretty cool.
added it up. It might have been Toledo, Springs, Toledo. I I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember where I saw it. Somebody added up all the records of the fighters who were like, it's kind of been a fluctuating group, and there's sometimes debate about who exactly was considered among the Black Murderers Row, but it's almost like a mythical organization, so it's not entirely concrete as far as who belongs. And there have been fighters who have kind of been added over the years too, but point being, somebody added up the record of all of these fighters and it was like some of the most obscene shit. Like it was like 1200, like 1200, 119 and something, you know, something crazy. I was like, holy shit, that's nothing. They're just absolutely fucking crazy in terms of like the wins and losses ratio. And to think that there's so little footage of so many of these fighters, or in the case of some of them, footage that just is not there at the time. Like there's footage of them later in their careers, but not footage of some of the biggest fights or most important fights of their careers, you know?
I would love to see Lloyd Marshall, Jake LaMotta. Like LaMotta was another guy who didn't like, you know, was scared away from Black Murderers Row and fought a who's who of guys. And Marshall, you know, by all accounts, beat the living hell out of LaMotta, just whooped his ass. You know, from pillar to post, just beat, you know, one of the best performances of his career. And if you see the footage of Marshall, what's out there is some footage of him in his rematch with Charles. Like I mentioned, the footage of him of his fight in Europe. couple of other things here and there. The dude was different, man. You know, he was very slam bang, right in your face style, but like, you know, he was fun to watch, clearly fun to watch. He had a very, very fun style that would work well today, too. He would be very popular today and probably be really successful today. And there's no footage of a LaMotta who was an absolute animal during that period. This was prime LaMotta. This wasn't a guy who was past his prime or weight drained or whatever it may be. This was an absolute, you know, LaMotta who was tearing through dudes, and Marshall, by all accounts, beat him from pillar to post. It wasn't close, and Marshall beat his face to a pulp and just whooped on him. I would love to see footage of that fight. You know, Marshall, to see one of those guys at their absolute peak and great, you know, and clear, concise HD footage would be great. To see Charlie Burley, like you mentioned, you know, there's fighters of there's a footage of his fight against Oakland Billy Smith, but that's it. You know, and you get a sense of how great Charlie Burley really was, but you'd rather watch it against guys who really would have tested him, or against some, you know, fellow all-time greats. Like I mentioned, the Holman Williams footage that just uncovered, you know, less than a decade ago or so. It's only like 10, 15 seconds. That's it. You know, I mean, it's cool that you can still see that, a glimpse of anything, but at the same time, it's just like, you know, you're fiending for more. You know, and it goes at that time period, man. There's a lot of great fighters from that era that you just like, what the fuck? How is there nothing out there? They were doing things, but if you look more into it, there was reasons for that. I don't know all the details on it, but there was something going on with how film was preserved back then and how other stuff was going on, but it definitely led to an effect on a lot of stuff just not being documented.
I think that another kind of element that came into it too is that how film rights and how video rights and stuff were handled, because before a certain time, you know, fighters had nothing to do with that, or the average fighter had not a whole lot to do with that. And then, you know, when fighters, there are a number of fighters who started becoming more like celebrities, namely, I would say probably Jack Dempsey, started negotiating more and more the rights to what was filmed of their fights. And so I think that probably changed a lot of shit. But then especially in the 40s and 50s, when TV really entered the equation, and it was like, you know, it became corporate and stuff and got much bigger. Yeah, it complicated matters quite a bit. But even like Charlie Burley, we mentioned Ezzard Charles versus Charlie Burley. And I know Ezzard Charles was like, I think 20 or 21 at the time. He was fairly young. But like a middleweight version of Ezzard Charles would have been pretty cool to see, granted how skilled and quick he was as a heavyweight. And he never really got bigger than like 195, 200 pounds. And that was him as a fairly, at his heaviest. He was probably better at like 185 or so. But at like 160, 165, even just out of curiosity, I would have liked, you know, to see how that looked. But I talked to you about this before, and I guess I brought up Harry Greb earlier. I might as well bring up Ray Robinson. That's one of the other popular entries into the why don't we have footage of X, Y, or Z, you know, type of discussions. And almost every single time people say there's no footage of Ray Robinson in his prime. Or I guess what they mean to say is there's no footage of Ray Robinson as a welterweight, which is something that has actually gone around for decades and decades. And it's been, you know, cemented as one of those things that everybody knows, because it's one of those things that like Burt Sugar and stuff like that used to repeat. Oh, there is no footage of Ray Robinson in his prime, you know, shit like that. And it was like, okay, I got you.
Newfield said it on the Robinson documentary. The same exact thing.
We don't even know where it is.
And he was like, "This is like not having the early Sinatra recordings. You know, it's the most damning thing ever." And then they were showing all these clips of Robinson annihilating guys. Clip. Well, they mentioned there's nothing out there. We have nothing on him in his absolute prime, and it's a shame.
Which is just, I mean, it's just a bit of an exaggeration, because number one, there's footage of the Charlie Fusari fight, which was his final welterweight, his final defense of the welterweight title. So there is footage, and there's also actually quite a bit of footage of him as an amateur lightweight. So we can at least get an idea of how blindingly fast he was, which he was. He was totally fast. And in any case, it's just a little bit of an exaggeration. Of course, we wish we had more Ray
I would love.
Robinson
I mean,
footage.
people, I'm sure would drop wild money if they had access to a reel of Robinson, Kid Gavilan, either fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, those would be some cool fights. And I mean, even though he was definitely much older and advanced in his career, Robinson Armstrong.
Oh yes. Oh, by all means. Oh my God. Yeah, definitely. Just I'm sure that that fight was a rout. By all accounts, again, nothing really substantial happened in that. Robinson carried him, but just the passing of the torch, the history aspect of it, all that.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly. Just out of curiosity.
But the two fights from that era before, I'm going to try to segue this into something. I would die to. I always wanted to see was Willie Pep, Sandy Sadler too. And for various reasons, everyone's always said that that was Pep's finest hour. Like there was never more brilliant. He put on the best performance of his career. He went in on Sadler, man. And there's the photos of it. There's a famous photo of Pep, and he's leaning in. He has his fist up like that, doing the double thing. You see Sadler leaning back, just absolutely flustered and kind of leery, And it, like, Pep not only regained the title, it wasn't a rout though. Like Sadler beat the shit out of him too. They said,
Yeah, he
Pep
showed
looked
his
like he was run
toughness.
over.
Exactly. He had
Yes,
to go through
yeah.
hell.
He had to go through absolute hell to win that title back. At the end, they said it looked like Pep was just mugged, and he still was able to like squeeze by that. That shows you how tough that was. And there's no footage of that fight. Like, there's footage of Pep out there. Like we mentioned, not a ton of it, but there is footage of him. You can see his brilliance, especially against, I think, Ray Famichin, for instance. You can really see how brilliant he is with his footwork and how he really goes on because he put a pasting on him. But the fight that he put the absolute everything together, and he had to use every ounce of his skill, his tricks, everything together to overcome him for the only time in this series he was able to beat him, and is not out there. And that's a damn shame. Same thing also with the Zale and Graziano fights for that matter.
Yep.
1 and 2.
That's what I figured you were going to say too. Yeah.
Yeah, there's super grainy footage of the second one, I guess, right? From like, I don't know, an overhead
Like
or something.
a home video or something.
Yeah. And you can, even from that bullshit, you can still see how vicious it was between them, what was going, to a degree. But again, there's nothing out there of the two of them. And that's crazy too, because if you see those photos, it looks like an absolute monster movie, right? Graziano, his face wide open, bloody, screaming at him. Zale kind of doing the same thing, tearing into each other. My God, man.
They were both punchers. Neither of them were particularly slick. Both threw fucking haymakers,
Yes.
like just, I mean, you want to talk about, I'm already on the manual labor kick, bro. The man of steel, steel worker himself, fucking Tony Zale. He basically, I remember I don't remember. I remember reading a story that he told about when he was young working in a steel mill, and that he had seen that molten steel, they used to have to carry it in a bucket, and that he like was among kids, like young kids who would do this shit. They would carry molten steel, like, in a bucket, transport it, and that you had to hold the bucket with your hand, like, but that it was right next to the molten steel, and that if you moved your hand, like, you were going to lose your hand. And that he said that he had seen that shit happen, like that it had like torn the fucking hands, or like the skin and the flesh right from kids' hands. That's the kind of dude that we're dealing with here when we're talking about Tony Zale, a very hard fellow who served in the war too. And
exactly, he was out for 4 years before he had a handful of fights before he
by the time that even happened, he was like older. Yeah.
Yes, he was past it. He had a long career, and anyone who came back at that point, he was already past his prime. Graziano was a rampaging maniac in his prime. And Zale had always said, if I wasn't out for 4 years and still on the comeback trail, I would have, blasted Graziano out of there a lot easier earlier on, or whatever it was. But instead, they, made 2 all-time great fights, like ridiculous, and they went on both ends of the spectrum. You know what I mean? They said the first fight, Graziano beat the holy hell out of Zale for the entire fight until Zale, rallied back to knock him out in the last round. And then the second fight, Zale did the same thing before Graziano rallied back to knock him out. So, but there's nothing there,
Yeah.
And
there's a
who
lot
knows
of
if they'll ever be
photos.
uncut.
There's
Yes.
a lot of photos, thank goodness, so you can kind of get an idea, but it's not the same. You
But I'm
either
saying
way
though, you can
though.
from those photos, bro. Have you ever seen photos that look like you almost think that they were like staged because of how vicious they look?
Yeah, they're like
Graziano's
crumbled
face, the
into a
way he's
ball and shit.
yeah, and Graziano's face, the way he's like throwing a punch, and you see his mouth wide open, screaming, like come tearing into him. And Zale's same thing. Like they just, it looks like out of straight up something out of a movie, like out of a Rocky scene or some shit. Like it doesn't look real. But that
Right,
was
dude.
real life, man. That was two of the most vicious fights ever. Ray Arcel, everyone else that talked about it said they'd never seen anything like that. Like they thought someone was going to die that night. Like, it was absolute insanity. But, to talk about all those things, I wanted to bring it into how, for us at least, when we were younger, a lot of fighters I never thought I'd be able to see footage of. But thank
That's
God for
true.
YouTube and all the and all these modern things now. I've been able to see a lot of fighters that I was only able to read about when I was just younger. And I never thought I'd be able to see footage of, which has been pretty awesome.
Yeah, dude. There's no question. I remember hearing about like Yuri Arbachkov. Remember hearing
That's
about
exactly
Yoko Gushiken. I remember hearing about a number of those.
Orzabek Nazarov, Yanni
Yeah,
Bungu.
a number of African fighters, a number of Asian fighters. I remember hearing about a lot of these fighters, or well, not hearing, but reading about a lot of them in the ring or seeing them ranked. Because I mean, like, dude, I'm not gonna lie, I never really liked looking through the rankings that much. Like, I would look, but I wasn't scouring them because there were a lot of names I didn't know, and it's just words on a page like that. It's just names on a page and not really any cool stories. I liked the stories. I always liked the history stories and the anecdotes and shit. That was what I always liked about the ring and other boxing magazines like Boxing Illustrated and shit. But for me, yeah, dude, it's
Dude,
it,
it
it's
was
crazy to be able to actually have access to that video after reading about so many of those fighters for a long time.
and it's every type of fight you can think of. You know what I mean? Like when we were kids, like you mentioned, all these guys I would read about in ring. Until either they, you know, made it on Boxing After Dark sometimes. Like for instance, I read about Philip Holiday when he won the lightweight championship and he knocked out Jeff Fennick and other guys. I had never seen footage of Fennick, but I read about him, so I knew that was a big deal. And then he was going to appear on Boxing After Dark fighting Ivan Robinson, who I had seen. I was excited about something like that. Daniel Zaragoza was another dude who I had watched briefly his first fight with Hector Acero Sanchez, and then fell asleep during it because I was just a young punk who couldn't handle, who couldn't hang back then. And then, but I just read about him. I read about him being in a career and everything. I had seen footage of Wayne McCullough. Just randomly switching the channels. He appeared on ABC one time. They showed a clip of his title winning fight, so I was familiar with him. Then on Boxing After Dark, he's gonna fight him. I got hyped for shit like that. A few years later, I had been just reading about Orzabek Nazarov for a number of years and never seen anything of him. And then Showtime showed a brief clip of him knocking out the late Levander Johnson. So, that I always thought stuff like that was cool, that I finally was able to see clips of them eventually. But like you mentioned, when YouTube came around, that's when I was able to do, and it wasn't like that early on either. It took a few years because YouTube, when I first came out, there wasn't a lot of stuff uploaded. It took a while.
Yeah, and they were
And
getting rid of everything. Like as soon as shit was
yeah,
getting uploaded, it'd last like a week
absolutely,
and then
things
that
were
was
getting
gone.
deleted quick. But once people started getting consistent, there was a few pages out there that really started uploading like the obscure shit, and not all of it is still up there. Like you mentioned, some of it still gets deleted, but a lot of these guys, like you meant, a lot of the Asian fighters, a lot of the guys from Africa, a lot of different continent, different countries over there, like different just lower weight fighters, other fighters who just never had a big following, these obscure fights that Lee Groves wrote about in his book. All this shit was like starting to come
That's a
up.
good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, dude. There's a Lee Groves who we've talked to, like it's been a while, but we've talked to him on this show before. You should go check out if you're into this kind of stuff. He has a book called Closet Classics, Tales from the Vault. and it's about the fights that, by now you might have heard about some of them, but when he wrote it a number of years ago, they were less known, and several of them were not available on YouTube, but have since become available, which is super cool. I mean, it's in a way, it's like, oh, it almost sucks because there's some mystique about it, and it's cool to read about, but to actually be able to see it too is really cool. And yeah, and you sending me over and going like, oh shit, dude, I just found this thing that, there's a whole bunch of fights that you've sent me that I've just been like, I never even knew it was there. Holy shit.
There was a club fight that Lee wrote about in his book called Leland Hardy against Ike Padilla, two
Yeah, shit
heavyweights from the
this is
late
great.
80s, 90s, late 80s. And I think the fight was from what, 88 or 89 that I sent you?
Yeah.
Absolute bananas. Like one of the best, wildest fights you would ever see. And it has like less than 500 views on YouTube, which is absurd because like it was voted one of the best fights of the 80s, regardless of division. Two guys that just didn't do, one guy that was only like 2-0, another one that was like a 0.500 or something. Like this was a ridiculous fight. Like if it happened today on television, Twitter would break down. That type of shit. Like it was incredible.
Yeah, it was knockdown, 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 knockdown.
Yeah, man. And so to be able now to have this at your fingertips is pretty incredible. It's pretty awesome. And
Totally.
it also, I hate to mention it, but since we're in Hall of Fame season, it also gives the people who vote no excuse not to do their just homework because you have all this at your fingertips as well. You know what I mean?
Totally. No, totally. And it's a really great tool. Just because the information's there, of course, doesn't mean that people are actually going to seek it out, or you got to have the curiosity in the first place, and a lot of people just don't have it. But nonetheless, it is there, and to have access to it's super cool. Another
And
guy,
you know what's really cool too? The other thing I just wanted to mention, which is pretty awesome, is that not just for fighters, that the people that upload the entire shows, because a lot of the
yeah,
fights get uploaded. It's cool to see the fights, but it's rare for me to be able to find like the entire show, something from start to finish, or the
yeah,
intros and all that, just to get a feel of being back in that era. And when the people do that, I get hyped.
yeah, dude. I think that well, just speaking frankly, they have to be careful because of shit like ring walks. They'll play music, and if the YouTube algorithm catches the
Totally.
music, they'll ding that shit for copyright. So and now the YouTube algorithm's gotten like, actually they run some AI algorithm that's gotten pretty smart and catches a lot of fairly obscure shit actually. So they have to be careful, but nonetheless, dude, I appreciate those people making those putting those videos out there. And I was just going to say, another guy that reminded me that I remember hearing about before I saw him was David Izon. And now that was way back in the day, of course, but I remember hearing about David Izon in like sometime in the 90s, because obviously Olympic boxing was like more of a big deal back then than it is now. But I remember hearing about him because he made an appearance at the Olympics and was like good, and had a, not trying to be an asshole, but a memorable name, like he had a name that stuck out. David Izonrite is what he went by back then. And so I remember that like sticking out. And so when I finally got to actually see him, and kind of sucks that he was like getting banked around everywhere, but by that time, but he was definitely a promising amateur. But yeah, and it is kind of cool also, since we're actually there, Felix Savone. I remember reading a shit ton about Felix Savone and never really getting to see a whole lot of like the more memorable fights, like the David Tua fight. Like that shit didn't happen. That shit was not footage that was like going around. So to be able to see like amateur greats like Felix Savone and stuff like that, yeah, pretty
Dude, when
useful.
he first, to my knowledge, the only time HBO aired an amateur thing was the Goodwill Games in like 1998 or something, right? 98, 90, around that time. And I remember that because that was like an HBO Docs and After Dark special. They aired it, like, Lamps, Roy Jones, and Larry Merchant were the commentators for it. Happened at the Garden. Happened in the theater at the Garden. And Savone fought Devarro Williamson in the main event. I think I posted the clip on Twitter or something, but like It was cool. It was really cool for, again, like you mentioned, to finally see Felix Savon, because amateur boxing at that point too was already being shown, especially with the Olympics being shown at random ass hours that I definitely, unless I was lucky, I wasn't going to catch it. So to finally see him and to act, to hear Lampley commentate one of his fights and get hyped like he would for like a major title fight, the way Savon knocked him out, and that's what makes it Felix Savon, Felix Savon. Like, when the way he flattened Williamson with that big right hand, and everyone was just like, big right hand, because it was an exciting fight. Savone was hurt early on. Williamson came out swinging, and he was like, Williamson's like, you hear Lampley, big right hand by Williamson, another one, Savone backing up, has to score, big right hand by Savone, it's over. Like, like that shit was cool.
Dude, it's shit is poor DeVero Williamson, because dude could chuck him, but when he got knocked out, he got
touched,
knocked out.
He went to sleep. Hence his nickname, Touch of Sleep.
Yeah. When he got knocked out, when he got knocked out, he got knocked out. Unfortunately, he got pretty good. But no, it's really cool to actually be able to see, a lot of those kinds of fighters. Yeah. But anyway, there was another fighter I was going to say that I've heard a lot about over the years, and I was just going to squeeze this last one in here on my part before we got out of here. If you have any more, feel free. But a guy who I read about in magazines a number of years ago, but I've obviously gotten more familiar with research-wise over the years, is Les Darcy, a guy who is talked about quite a bit on a whole different circuit that you will never almost ever hear American, historians and shit talking about.
Never. Absolutely ever. Light heavyweight, right?
Yeah, well, he was in a few different divisions, but yeah, middleweight, light heavyweight.
Yeah. Great fighter too, man. Died extremely young, a la Harry Greb. And because he died such a long time ago, and because he, for various circumstances, didn't have a good reputation when he first made his way to the United States, he's basically not, forgotten today.
Yeah, died young. One of those fighters that a lot of people were certain would accomplish a lot more and go on to become a world champion.
They all thought that he was going to be a world champ eventually too, man. And he had the reputation to do it too. He beat some incredible guys like Eddie Merguti and a few others during his escapades here. But he, I think it was, did he get sick? Or he caught something, right? But he was also called. There's a lot of layers to his story that's to get into. But
well, now I'm about to look it up because I was thinking about it as we were talking, and I was like, oh, Les Darcy, that's another one. But I want to say it was a truck accident. Let me double check now. I want to say, but let me look. No, you're right. Pneumonia. All right. Excuse me.
People also said too that he died of a broken heart or something because of the allegations thrown at him and what was going on with him. I don't know, but that's a great call. It's one of those guys that a fascinating fighter, rarely ever mentioned. He's never mentioned actually, and because he came from the same era as Stanley Ketchel, they, their careers didn't really cross paths, but they were in the same realm. If both had lived, potentially they could have fought. But yeah,
yeah,
he just,
for sure.
Because he goes from that era, it's more or less that he's forgotten now because of that. Because who else is going to be forgotten? Who's going to be more remembered, Ketchel or Les Darcy?
Well, I think I'm seeing a technological, common thread with a lot of the fighters and the fights that we've mentioned, that a lot of them have been around the same time, kind of in that like 1900 to 1930-ish range. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Because I think a lot of it's probably technological, but man, like in terms of preservation and stuff like that. But yeah, dude, there's so many fighters that have basically been lost from those years.
Even fights that the promoters demand that the shit gets destroyed. I don't think there's any footage of Danny Lopez actually winning the featherweight championship from David Cote, right? I think that the footage gets cut out after certain rounds when they realize that you know, there was no chance in hell that Cote was going to win the fight, and yeah.
Well, similarly to Jack Johnson Jeffries, where it cuts off as they're, you know, like they don't even, you don't get the
Exactly, yeah, the
full
police have to
stoppage.
make sure that they stop the fight right before that, yeah.
And I think the same with Jack Johnson, Tommy Burns, where like they're, you get to see it, but not the ending of the
But you
fight
don't see
because
the
they were,
ending of it. Yeah, there's that clip of like Burns about to like fly over the. It looks like he's flying over the ropes
yeah,
while John pummeling him, and then everything just goes full stop
yeah,
right
they're
there.
like, whoa, we can't
Yeah,
allow this white
okay,
boy.
stop the footage. We can't have this anymore. Yeah.
No, it's illegal to film a white guy getting his ass fucking
Yeah.
reamed by this fellow. Yeah, it's terrible. So no, there are a number of fights like that, yeah, where there's like, what the fuck? Well, I guess not a number, but a memorable
I mean,
handful.
no, there's a few of them, you know, and people would pay crazy money to be able to see footage of it if it would exist.
Totally.
I remember people telling me, you know, not too long ago that there were certain fights that have since been uploaded to YouTube that they were sworn to secrecy, never to actually show it to anybody. But like I said, it's been since uploaded to YouTube, and I wonder how they feel about that. Well, not the people who own it, but like the ones who originally had it, because at the back then they thought they had something super rare, you know, and all that. But
Well, you know, I mean, dude, that shit's like impossible to keep. Like, I mean, nearly impossible to keep a secret like that these days. Like, if you're once it goes to the internet, like once it gets put out into the ether, that shit it's out. There's no stuffing Pandora back into her bag. However, however the analogy goes. Yeah, dude. No, it's unfortunate that we're absent a lot of the footage of a lot of these fighters. But look, dude, I appreciate you helping set the record straight on a lot of these fighters so that these people know, so that so that they can stop coming at us and stop getting mad about these fighters there's no footage of. We're just going to redirect them to this podcast episode now.
yeah, man, it's some guys I have a feeling nothing's ever going to be uncovered. Other ones, it's out there. Just look, even if it's small, it's something.
Totally, dude. Keep your eyes to the skies. You know, keep going to the
Yeah.
rummage sales and the garage sales, and yeah, man. You know, buy
I'm
that
finding
50
new
cent.
shit every day that I never knew existed, whether it's actual fight footage or interview footage, which I find all history stuff fascinating. You know what I mean? Like I'm just a history buff, whether it's boxing history or just history. Like I love history shit. And whenever I find new stuff, whether it's like a new Sonny Liston interview or it's gonna be this or this guy jump roping or whatever it may be, I'm gonna be into it. I'll probably send it to you or whatever because it's cool stuff. You know, like the Marciano the
Yeah,
Marciano funeral stuff the other day.
yeah,
You know
the
what I mean?
interviews.
Yeah. Or like a newsreel of Billy Conn talking about Billy Conn punching out a robber in 1990. Like shit like that is cool. You know, it doesn't have to it's boxing related. It doesn't have to be a fight, but there's always new stuff to uncover. There's a world out there of all this cool stuff. And anytime I read something that catches my eye, the first thing I'm gonna do is look on YouTube to see if it exists.
That's literally got to be the first thing, dude. And there's actually, you know what? Hopefully, I'm not giving up any sort of weird secret here, but there are sites that allow you to search unlisted videos. So, sorry, collectors, but if you've uploaded it, there are ways to actually find it. That shit ain't that secret. So, go ahead and give those sites a Google and get to searching, motherfuckers. But seriously, look, there's all sorts of possibilities. And I mean, I do keep my eyes open for like garage sales and stuff like that. I don't go to them a lot of the time, but sometimes I'll look on Craigslist and those kinds of places to see if there are things that like new uncovered gems might be discovered. But look, it's tough to go through everything. We are missing some footage of some of these fighters, but we also have a lot too. There's a lot of shit I still haven't seen. But either way, like I said, Aris, I do appreciate you doing another history episode with me and setting the record straight. In the meanwhile, before we do another either history or true crime or otherwise episode, if you are on social media, For instance, if you are on Twitter, follow my boy Aris Pina at Punch Zone Aris. Follow me, Patrick Connor, at Patrick M. Connor. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. But what you should do is you should subscribe on YouTube and subscribe on whatever podcast app it is you listen to us through. That would be very much appreciated. Throw us a rating, all those sorts of things. And Aris, we will be in contact, bro. Thank you.
Absolutely, man. It's been a blast as always.
All right, everybody, take it easy.
Later.